More on that headline story now, and advice given since the 1980s which told millions of people to avoid eating fatty foods such as butter and cheese should have never been introduced due to a lack of solid scientific evidence. That's the suggestion by a new review into dietary advice. The review, published in the journal Open Heart, says the guidance distracted people from avoiding other unhealthy choices, especially carbohydrates. Well, joining us now from Cardiff is Zoe Harcombe. She's from the Institute of Clinical Exercise and Health Science at the University of the West of Scotland and led that review. Very good morning to you.
Good morning.
This, might I say, is another example of the sort of contradictory advice we get about what we should eat that actually just leads to lots of confusion, doesn't it?
It does, but this has been consistent advice for the last 30 years to eat less fat, and that necessarily leads people to eat more carbohydrate. And what we've done with this study is to review the best possible evidence that was available at the time, and it does not show that there was support for the dietary guidelines that were introduced.
So if we look specifically at what the advice was around eating fatty foods like butter and cheese, what undermines that in your opinion?
Okay, so the specific advice was that we should have no more than 30% of our total calorie intake in the form of any kind of fat and no more than 10% of our diet in the form of saturated fat. And that then drove us down the route. Indeed, our government's told us, base your meals on starchy foods. We talked about healthy whole grains, we demonised eggs, we said butter should be avoided, we shouldn't be eating red meat, and yet those are the nutrient-dense foods. So we've driven people away from the things that we've evolved to eat, meat, fish, eggs, dairy products, nuts and seeds, things that do contain fat, and we've led them instead to have far more cereals and breads. And what we're saying is the evidence wasn't there for the advice at the time, and perhaps with 30 years of hindsight, we should look at what we're facing today in terms of obesity epidemics, type 2 diabetes epidemics, and see if there is any connection with that change in dietary advice.
So what are you saying? Are you saying that people should actually eat more of these foods which are higher in saturated fats?
Absolutely. I mean, foods are high in fat generally. It's very rarely known that every food that contains fat contains all three natural fats, saturated, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. We've also been talking for the past 30 years as if we can either eat or avoid saturated fat, and that is simply not the case. Any food that has saturated fat also has monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and they tend to be the most nutrient-dense foods. So our primary advice, if we as the paper authors were put in charge of public health, would be to eat real food, go back to eating natural foods, and to move away from the cereals, the starchy carbohydrates, the breads, which come with many, many other ingredients generally that have become the staple of today's diet.
But with the fatty foods, don't you have the issue of cholesterol and the impact of that on heart disease, etc.?
Well, that's interesting. One of the strongest arguments that came in yesterday from the people who want to hold on to the conventional wisdom was, but we know saturated fat impacts cholesterol and cholesterol impacts heart disease. Well, first of all, we don't, because that's one of the things that we've been looking at in this study, the actual evidence behind these claims. And secondly, what we've said in this study is that there was no association, and there has been no association found since, between saturated fat and heart disease. So it actually doesn't matter what cholesterol is doing, and we describe in this paper what happens to cholesterol. If there's no association between A and C, what is happening to B really doesn't matter. We've got to look at the facts as they speak for themselves and not try to confuse it with other beliefs that we've adopted along the way.
Doesn't the old adage hold true, rather than trying to demonise one particular food type, that actually we should just eat a little bit of everything rather than too much of one food group?
Well, we would go back again to eat real food, work to get the micronutrients, the vitamins and the minerals that you need for optimal health. If you try to adopt an approach of look after the pennies and the pounds will look after themselves, so get the nutrients that you need, vitamins, minerals, you would naturally choose red meat, oily fish, eggs, full-fat dairy products, nuts and seeds, things that are naturally rich in fat because they happen to be also naturally rich in all the nutrients that we need for survival, let alone optimal health.
Okay, Zoe Harcombe, very good to talk to you. Thank you very much. The report author, Zoe Harcombe.